Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Value Podcast. Your host, Jacob Bremen. I am joined once again by frequent guests of the channel, Dr. Robert M. Price. And today we're going to be talking about Marcionite priority, but dating the New Testament books. Paul, could any of them have been real letters that go back to historical Paul? Are they all forgeries? That sort of business. But dating of the Gospels. Is some material in the Gospels predate Marcion? Are they all after Marcion? We're going to get into that as well. So, Dr. Price, in previous interviews, I've asked you about questions relating to this topic that we're getting into today. And today we're going to be getting into the more nitty-gritty, fine details of it. You make the assertion in The Amazing Colossal Apostle, and I think in other books as well, that when Tertullian gives a striking comment that Marcion discovered the epistle to the Galatians, you interpret it that he wrote Galatians, or at the very least, he wrote Galatians chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6. And you also say Galatians 1 and 2, the first two chapters are actually later chapters written later and put into the beginning. What led you to that conclusion that Tertullian most likely had to have been thinking that Marcion was the author of the text?
Well, I believe I read it. I know I read it somewhere else, but it immediately struck me that, boy, if that is true, I mean, the whole idea is so much like a more widely known phenomenon of creating a book and trying to establish an authoritative pedigree by saying, well, this is old and venerable. I just found it. Like the theory about Deuteronomy, where it says that they're trying to clean out the neglected temple, and they find this book, and the Hilkiah, the priest, I think, comes to King Josiah and says, I have found a book. And they read the whole thing to him, and you got all these curses like, if you guys betray the covenant with me, there's going to be hell to pay, and no high places, no polytheism, and all that stuff. And Josiah says, oh my God, we're in for big trouble. Well, apparently Hilkiah and Huldah, the priestess, and others wrote the book. And they're saying, oh, you haven't seen this before, Your Majesty. Neither have we. We found it under some Sunday school books and old tithing ledgers here. Here it is. In Tibet, there are a whole bunch of books that they claimed they dug up from the earth where they must have been deposited during times of persecution. Or then there's the Book of Mormon, where Joseph Smith said, well, this is written down by Mormon and Moroni and all these guys. But they showed me where to look, and here it is. It's like it's another form of pseudepigraphy, where you're claiming that this has ancient roots and therefore ancient knowledge and wisdom, and it comes from God, not from some schlumpf like you and me. And so it struck me, what else would it mean that Marcion just happened to read this for the first time? What context does that imply? I mean, I don't, it seems to me it makes the best sense, though I admit it's not absolutely clear. But it seems to me if I got to go in one direction or the other, I think he means that Marcion had never seen this before, and perhaps neither had anybody else.
Yeah, when I go over that the point that you made over and over again, I have to admit it is strange, because I think consensus scholars, when it comes to Paul, need to look at Tertullian a bit more closely, because he's probably writing late, not as late as everyone else. He's early enough to the time, he's close to the time of Marcion, and he's making this really strange claim that, like, okay, why would he make something like that up? Why would a Christian like him make that up? Because to even assert something like that does not benefit the church. It does not benefit Christianity to say that Marcion was the one that discovered Galatians. I just, it's like, I suppose one could try to bounce and say, well, maybe Tertullian didn't like the letter to the Galatians, so he tried to make this ridiculous claim that Marcion was the origin of it. But that doesn't sound like that's the reason he's saying that to me. And I think scholars should take a look at that more closely and not be as dismissive as they are and assume that it's secure, because that is really strange to me.
Well, of course, I'm just saying that Tertullian means to say that the epistle was around, but Marcion had never seen it up until a certain time. And then he tried to make hay out of it. And I'm saying, I suspect what really happened was that the reason he hadn't seen it was he hadn't written it yet. The Tertullian doesn't mean to say that. There's something similar about the Gospel of John. Some said that Cerinthus had written it, the Jewish Gnostic. And Robert Eisler came up with something in one of the fragments of Papias. It says that Marcion was John, son of Zebedee's amanuensis or secretary, and that he was writing it down as John dictated it and showed him the result. And John suddenly said, "What is this? No one has ever seen God," and so on and so on. And he said, "Well, where'd you get this? I didn't say this." And that Marcion had corrupted the text by adding to it. Well, of course, that's just a ham-handed way of trying to explain away parts of our Gospel of John that sound Marcionite, and there are parts of it that do. So I wonder if it's the same sort of clumsy attempt here, that there's something that there's floating around in Tertullian's head, the idea that Marcion may actually have written it, but he doesn't want to say that because he wants to quote it against Marcion, which he does. Though he doesn't mention some passages which he doesn't say Marcion omitted, which he does with the Gospels, for instance. But that one of them is about Paul's first journey to Jerusalem. And that's where he says he met James, the brother of the Lord. And if that was in the copy of Galatians Tertullian was reading, surely he would have quoted that, because that's the one that said, "I went up to Jerusalem to set my gospel before the bigwigs because I didn't want to be disqualified." What the heck? If that's the case, that just makes Tertullian's point, and all the Catholics in the 2nd century, that Marcion was just a subordinate of the apostles who went bad. So it strikes me that somebody did add it in there later for that reason. And I think they just don't, they laugh it off, literally. I remember when I was debating Bart Ehrman, I mentioned this. He appeared never to have heard this and thought it was ridiculous. Well, Karl Barth's teacher, Rudolf Steck, believed that the whole thing was non-Pauline. And the Dutch radicals, he wasn't even one of them, believed that. And there was a whole, though small, school of thought that said, look at all the problems here. These are not only not written by Paul or by any single overarching author, but each epistle appears to be a patchwork. And boy, is that the case with something like 1 Corinthians, where you have one view about secret knowledge and then the opposite view, one view about speaking in tongues and how good it is, and then it's put down. Can women prophesy in church? Yes, they can. A few chapters later, no, they can't. Can you eat meat offered to idols? Well, yeah. And then no way you'll go to hell if you do. And what is this? Was the guy a multiple personality? Or don't you have a kind of anthology of competing Paulinist writings? And I think you do.
What is interesting is on that point that you made there, and I think this myself, the letters, many of them, about 6 of them, 2nd Thessalonians, Colossians, 1st Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. There might be another one that I can't remember. I think Philippians is another one. That claims multi-authorship. Oh, Silas, Timothy, Sosthenes, multiple authors. And that I think, regardless if they're authentic or not, it's an admission in itself that there is multi-authorship in the Pauline text.
That's a very natural reading, but most people won't hear it.
Right. I think that in itself explains, even if one takes the point of view that 7 of them are authentic, or as you call them, the lucky 7. It is a good and detailed explanation, a very simple explanation to explain the contradictions in the Pauline text anyway, regardless.
Yeah.
Okay, so assuming Marcion wrote Galatians 3-6, I know that there are some Dutch radicals that I think they think that Marcion wrote a lot more than that in the Pauline text. Do you take that view? Do you think Marcion wrote more of the Pauline epistles, or just Galatians 3-6?
I think it quite likely that he wrote the original draft of Ephesians, which he called Laodiceans. R. Joseph Hoffman did a fascinating study in his great book on Marcion, where he showed how you could pretty easily identify the interpolations added to it to de-Marcionize it, and that and it made a lot of sense to me. So I think he probably wrote that. I'm even tempted to think part of Romans was written by Simon Magus, though there's no way to know. I forget now exactly why I said that. I'd have to go read it again, but it's possible he even wrote some of that. I think Colossians is straight Gnosticism. You still have the source problem of the relation of Ephesians to Colossians, but Colossians strikes me as almost Valentinian, though simple in its presentation. But in Christ, the fullness, the pleroma of the deity dwells bodily, and all this stuff. It sure sounds that the resurrection of Jesus, that you are raised with Jesus in baptism, which is why the Corinthians didn't believe in a future resurrection, and so on. So it sounds to me like some of the Pauline stuff is Marcionite, some of it is Gnostic, and that the pastorals are Catholic. They're an attempt to domesticate Paul, because there's a crying silence, not quoting the Pauline epistles in 2nd century writings, with a couple of exceptions, and the references to them are kind of weird. Like I think Polycarp that says to the Philippians, Paul says so and so in all his letters to you. All his letters to Philippi? Well, Bornkamm and Schmidtals both independently carved Philippians up into 3 original short letters. Maybe that's what he's referring to. But there are, in First Clement, take up the letter Paul wrote to you. The letter? Did he know about 2nd Corinthians, or was that written as a sequel, just like 2nd Peter was written as a sequel to 1st Peter, but not by the same guy? There's all kinds of weird things, and you get the impression in the 2nd century they didn't like Paul because, as Tertullian said toward the end of the century, Paul was the apostle of Marcion and the apostle of the heretics. That's why they had to try to rehabilitate him, because they couldn't ignore the success of Marcionism. It was like spreading like wildfire all over the Mediterranean, and that's why they decided, well, maybe we should have a Christian scripture. And of course, we have to include Marcion's content, but we've got to sanitize it. So let's put in the stratum of what Winsome and Rowe called the pastoral stratum, various things like Romans 12. Now let's be obedient Romans and so forth. And then 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, which make him sound like a observant, tame Catholic. And that makes a heck of a lot of sense to me.
So which part of Romans do you think could have been written by the historical Simon Magus, who you think is Paul the Apostle?
Boy, I'd have to look at it again, but it wouldn't have been the opening part about how Jews have no real advantage over Gentiles if they don't keep the law, whereas Gentiles don't even have to know about the Torah to be justified by having the laws in their hearts. That's more, I think, J.C. O'Neill's right in that is some sort of Hellenistic Jewish synagogue sermon by who knows whom. Marcion didn't have chapters 9 through 11 about Israel, so I suspect that couldn't have been it. The last chapter and a half, Bauer effectively argued that was a Jewish Christian addition. So I'm guessing it must have been a part of the thing from Abraham on through chapter 8 about you're no longer slaves to sin and stuff like that. I'd have to go look at my argument for it again, though.
So when would that part of Romans then date? Would you put that? I'm assuming you would put that still after the Jewish War. Is Simon Magus alive after the Jewish War, in your opinion? Did he die before the war, during the war?
Well, I suspect afterward, but he is associated by Josephus, at least a Simon, who appears to have been a magician, with Felix and Festus and those guys, the jet set of the Herodian circles, with whom Paul is associated. Simon was, which is one reason I think Simon was Paul. And that would still be before the war, but who knows what happened to Simon, really. There's this notion in these apocryphal texts that he perished after crashing when his special effects failed him and he was flying through the air. Boom. But it is kind of ambiguous in the book of Acts. For instance, Papias mentions the prophesying daughters of Philip in the 2nd century, but in Acts, they're already there with Paul. So I'm not sure exactly when Simon really would have lived, or when Paul really lived. I mean, there's this problem with him, as you know. When did he die? I mean, assuming there was a Paul, because the only evidence we have is worthless. It's from the Acts of Paul and laden with absurd legend. We don't know when the guy died. So maybe he did last after the war.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so it's possible. So therefore, it's possible it could be pre-war, during the war, after the war. That's part of Romans, whenever it was written and whenever Simon died. Okay, so is there anything else in the Pauline epistles do you think could possibly go back to Simon Magus besides Romans, a piece of Romans?
Well, I guess another way of looking at Galatians would make it sound kind of Simonian, since he believed the law had been given by the angels who created the the world. Marcion, at least in what we know about him, I guess in his mature thought, the demiurge created it. But if you give weight to the plurality of angelic creators, that sounds, with Simonianism, that sounds more like Galatians. And Irenaeus tells us that Simon taught you don't have to keep the Torah to be saved, because the angels gave it. That sounds an awful lot like Galatians. So I suppose you could say he might have written that. But it's just that the stuff about Paul laying his case before the bigwigs, the pillars, that sounds like Marcion in Rome. And so I admit that this is all complex and iffy, but it does sound to me very odd to try to harmonize this with the traditional view of Paul and the epistles.
Do you think the historical Paul, regardless if he wrote any of the pieces in Galatians 1 and 2 or not, do you think Simon Magus ever came into conflict with the historical James and the historical Cephas? Or is that just a Marcionite era backdating of Marcion's conflict with the church?
Well, it would fit the Eisenman scenario that Paul was a member of the Qumran sect who was kicked out for offering a simpler gospel to the simple ones of Ephraim, Gentiles, apparently God-fearers, because that sounds an awful lot like Simon Magus being in the sect of John the Baptist, which he's been associated with the Essenes theoretically for a long, long time. And he has a face-off after John's death. He has a confrontation with Dositheus, another Gnostic disciple of John, as to who's going to be the standing one. And he wins. And Dositheus goes off and hangs out his own shingle for his own movement. And then Simon started his. Now, if Simon was Paul, that would make a lot of sense to me. And that would mean, he probably did know James, whoever he was, the teacher of righteousness, or one of the three in the inner circle in Qumran. This is the stuff I get into in the last chapter of my Judaizing Jesus. And I say that they didn't even have Jesus in their Qumran-esque Jewish Christian movement before Paul/Simon demanded that they give him a place as part of the compromise by which he would bring monetary tribute to the Jerusalem church / Qumran community, but that didn't hold for long because they decided that, well, maybe we can just take the direct approach and siphon off his converts, and we won't need to worry about this jerk anymore, which is why they sent people around dogging Paul's footsteps, saying, he means well, but the guy's wrong. You do have to keep the Torah. I mean, that makes sense to me, but I admit I'm kind of like Biogen and his buddies here. There's no way to know if that's true. It's just seems a plausible scenario to me.
When do you date the writings of Ignatius? And I'm asking you about this because, as you know, Ignatius mentions Paul and seems to be aware of the letters. I've heard arguments that Ignatius is really, I think his name is Peregrinus, if I'm pronouncing it.
Peregrinus, who was also a Christian for a while, and wrote a bunch of epistles.
Do you think that he is Peregrinus, or that Ignatius is way later than commonly thought?
No, I think he could very well be the same man, because Lucian of Samosata is in the 2nd century, I think, and he tells us about Proteus Peregrinus and his martyrdom. And that's the big thing that happened with Ignatius, and they both have epistles attributed to him. and they both were prisoners, and so that I think the Ignatian epistles may be dated roughly correctly, but they're probably based on a later tradition of Ignatius's martyrdom, because the guy that wrote, I can't think of his name offhand, wrote Supernatural Religion. He, 19th century, I guess, he said that he pointed out that even though only a later source conveys it, this author mentions a tradition that Ignatius was martyred not in Rome, but in Antioch. That why would they have taken him to Rome? It would have been more effective to martyr him among his own people, take a warning, what's the point? And that the idea of him writing letters to people on his way to Rome is just a way of explaining how these spurious letters actually emitted from Rome supposedly came from the martyr Ignatius. So I tend to think that he's right. I mean, if everybody knew he was taken to Rome and martyred, where would this other version have come from? It's like in the Gospels, if you got a more spectacular one and a less spectacular, which one's likely to be historical? So it's their second century, but even there, you got to wonder, because church organization seems to be at a later point, with a monarchical bishop who runs everything. Church mouse can't eat a crumb of cheese without getting the bishop's permission, and so forth. Does this sound like even in the pastoral epistles? No. And they're already second century. So I'd say later in the second century, though, again, Ignatius himself was probably killed a couple of decades earlier.
Mm-hmm. That takes me to the dating of the Gospels, since we got, so we pretty much got the dating of Paul out of the way. Whatever pieces might have been written by Paul is either Paul Simon Magus, the little pieces, is perhaps pre-war, during war, after war. It also depends on when he dies, and the answer on that is not so clear at the moment. So the dating of the Gospels. There are some scholars out there that take the position of full Marcionite priority, that the whole thing is after Marcion, and they all depend on Marcion's Gospel of the Lord in some way. When do you date the Gospels?
Well, I know there's this guy, Marcus Vincent, I think, has written a book on the dating of the Gospels vis-a-vis Marcion. I got it, I can see it on the shelf, but I've not yet read it. I know there was also an article years and years ago by Jean-Paul Couchot, where he said there's a missing synoptic gospel, and that was the gospel of the Marcionites. But I've read that, but I can't keep it straight in my head. But on other grounds, I think the gospels are all second century. And one big reason for that is, if Mark is the earliest, and it seems to me that it is, I still go with the two source hypothesis, then there are several signs of delay of the parousia, the second coming. It's as if there were several successive embarrassments. They would set new dates like the Jehovah's Witnesses did, and they would pass, and the gospel would have to be altered. So it's like Matthew. It's hard to pin it down because there were different versions, different editions of it. But in the Little Apocalypse, we're told that when you see the fig tree bloom, you know it's right at the door. And this generation will not pass until these things have come about. But then immediately, of course, if you want to know the day or the hour, I can't tell you that. Even I don't know. Now, that has to be a way of trying to correct the statement you just heard. Well, I don't really know. And it's sort of like when I just said, here's my view of the early church, but of course we don't know it. Well, so it's like they weren't at liberty to just cut stuff out. They had to add stuff that would make you think you were misinterpreting the earlier thing. Well, then also somebody added to the Mark and Apocalypse, but first the gospel has to be preached to the whole creation. That aren't you saying? This is like in Second Thessalonians. Look, you're thinking it's going to be real soon, but all this stuff has to happen first. So, relax. That sounds like what we've got talk in Mark 13. And also there are going to be famines and revolutions and all this stuff, but the end is not yet. So it's like there's several speed bumps in the road, and I have to wonder if they were originally in there. Then you get over to Mark, the end of Mark 8, I guess it is, right before the transfiguration, where it says there's some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God come with power. Some? I thought it was the whole generation. Well, this implies that whenever this was added, there were some in the original generation still around waiting, sucking their thumb, and so they figured, well, okay, some, that's better than nothing. But then it follows that the transfiguration happens. What? Why is that the sequel to this statement? Well, because everybody's dead from the founding generation. So must be that Jesus was talking about something else that would have happened during his ministry, transfiguration. And some standing here, well, maybe that just means he took only 3 of the guys with him. No explanation as to why. And so then you've got in John 21, the Johannine appendix, Lord, is he gonna, what kind of death is the beloved disciple going to die? Hey, look, that's none of your business. If I want him to remain alive till I return, what is that to you? And then the editor says, now, he didn't actually say what some people say he said, that this disciple who's now dead was going to live until the second coming, because he didn't, obviously. And then finally, you got 2 Peter. There are scoffers around and say, where's this coming he promised? Ever since the fathers, the founding generation, fell asleep, everything's continued the way it has since creation. He says, well, these smartasses ought to keep in mind that yeah, there's been a delay, but God's got all the time in the world. He's giving you a break, Buster. Why don't you take this time to repent before it is too late? So, I mean, now, which is pretty rational, actually. That's the best of all the explanations. And so it seems to me you've got already within Mark, and leaving out Luke and what Conselman shows about how he's delaying the whole thing, it implies how long must this have taken? And so it seems to me this pushes Mark very likely into the 2nd century. And then did Matthew and Luke get Mark hot off the presses? They get an early review copy or something immediately? No, Matthew has at least a couple of stages of composition, and who knows how long it took for somebody to think, gee, Mark needs to be beefed up, let's do it. Then somebody else does the same thing. How many decades are we talking about here? And so I think they all very likely are 2nd century works written not long before Irenaeus lists the 4 that are amenable.
What about the dating of Luke Acts? There are, you've talked about this before in a previous interview that we did. That Luke Acts, the author of Luke Acts, might be connected to Lucius Turinus, or Theophilus, the bishop of Antioch, in the late 2nd century, something like that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's very likely, especially with David Trobish's argument that Luke was Polycarp of Smyrna. because the anti-Marcionite element in Luke and Acts is clear, though it doesn't permeate it. But there are a couple of places where you say, what is this? That it's definitely anti-Marcionite. Joseph Tyson shows that pretty well in his book. Oops. Can you pause it?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Okay, there.
Luke and Acts both have anti-Marcionite statements in them, which implies Marcionism is already rampant and is prominent enough to need refutation. But there's all sort. Oh yeah, and if that's Polycarp who was doing the writing, who also would have been the writer of the pastorals, which other scholars have said before now, and the pastoral stratum that Winston Monroe talked about. And, I mean, all that stuff is very much like the epistle of Polycarp to the Philippians. Well, then it makes sense if he's writing to Theophilus. The two guys were contemporaries, they would have known each other, and it implies that not everybody had a firm grasp on whatever the Jesus story was, because Luke starts out saying, now a lot of people have written about this, but apparently there's some confusion, so I've decided to make the authoritative account so you'll know for certain what we're talking about here. And then the same thing in pretty much in the preface of Acts, both are addressed to Theophilus. So I think it probably is Theophilus of Antioch. And that helps place it in the 2nd century. But even if we didn't have anything like that, the similarity between Luke's gospel and Acts and the Hellenistic novels, which flourished in the 2nd century, though there were older and later ones, like Kyrios and Calirrhoe and the Ephesian Tale and various other ones. That implies that it's following the same genre conventions and that they're probably around the same time. The fact that there is kinship between Luke and the infancy gospel tradition, like Jesus as a kid in the temple showing that he has mature wisdom already. That really belongs in the infancy gospels and probably was drawn from there. And then the delay motif, where Jesus says, there's some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God come, period. Nothing about with power, a phrase usually used in connection with the end time resurrection. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power, and so on. And there are other reasons too. The Greek seems to be a bit later and to match very nicely that of the pastoral epistles and the apostolic fathers. So it seems to me many things point to the 2nd century Polycarp authorship of Luke and Acts.
And the Gospel of John, you mentioned that, what was the name? Cerinthus? As the possible author of John. Who do you think most likely wrote John? Cerinthus or somebody else?
Well, we don't know if Cerinthus was just a guess, just like John was just a guess by somebody else. But it is interesting that the gospel is conspicuously Gnostic. It doesn't get into all the cosmological details of full-blown Valentinianism or something like that, but then neither does the Gospel of Truth discovered in Nag Hammadi, which is by Valentinus. It doesn't go into all of that stuff. But John seems to me Gnostic, and you can't convince me that Bultmann was wrong in saying there are observable strata in this gospel, and that originally there was completely realized eschatology and Gnostic material borrowed from the Mandeans, the sect of John the Baptist, but that later what he called an ecclesiastical redactor went over it and tried to correct it by adding back futuristic eschatology and sacramentalism and so forth. Like in chapter 5, I think Jesus says, the hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. But then a few verses down, he says, the day is coming, no, now, and the dead in their graves, right, the rotting dead, right, the actual physically dead, will come forth from their graves to answer for what they did in life. It seems like somebody is, well, I can't get rid of that earlier thing, but let me paraphrase it and add something that'll bring it in line with orthodoxy. And or in John chapter 6, Jesus with the telling people to eat his flesh and drink his blood. This sounds kind of like wisdom has set her table for the feast back in the book of Proverbs, but then it starts getting like Ignatius and the medicine of immortality. It starts sounding like a physical sacramentalism, and that's probably because it's been added. And so I just think that's that, yes, it was Gnostic to begin with, and Cerinthus is a pretty good candidate. He was a Jewish Gnostic.
So we're talking about Cerinthus. He lived in I'm making sure we're talking about the same Cerinthus. He's supposed to be a contemporary and opponent of John the Evangelist.
Well, that would fit, and that is interesting because it kind of fits with that thing from Papias that Eisler noted, where Marcion is associated with John as someone who is subverting his gospel. Well, here you've got Cerinthus as opposed to John. Is that because there is, or a substitute for John, is that because someone is trying to say, yeah, Cerinthus really wrote this, but John, some Orthodox writer, has worked it over. Though I suspect it was Polycarp. I think Polycarp was the ecclesiastical redactor of John and of Luke. I think he authored at least the second half of Acts. That gets into theory by C.C. Torrey. And that he may have been the redactor at some stage of Matthew, because in the keynote speech of Jesus, he says, now don't go thinking I came to abolish the law and the prophets. Oh no, I came to fulfill them. The law and the prophets? This isn't Paul. Paul didn't say Jesus came to negate the scriptures, right? He's talking about the commandments of the Torah, but the Matthean Jesus is saying, some say I came to abolish the Jewish scripture. Now, who does that sound like? So I have a hunch there's an anti-Marcionite connection in Matthew. And if, finally, Morton Smith did not forge the little bit of the secret gospel, if there actually was, if that was the earlier version, as I think Crossan and some others think, that would explain what happened to it. Somebody cut it out. Stephen Huller showed that Marcella, I believe her name is, who was a Carpocratian Gnostic, went to Rome when Polycarp was there, and surely must have shown him the gospel that she used, which would have been the gospel according to the Egyptians, which sounds like the little bit we have of the secret gospel of Mark. I know that's a kind of Rube Goldberg connect the dots thing, so we don't know that's true, but boy, would that fit real well.
I would like to do in the future, I would like to do a whole show just about the secret gospel of Mark. That sounds very fascinating.
Oh yeah.
Okay, last question for this episode about Cerinthius. Okay. If one were to say he wrote John, that would make John like before Marcion. Um, do you think that's possible, or do you think John is better placed after Luke?
Well, it gets really messy because it
Hmm.
seems to me that somebody who had eventually had copies of Luke and John, maybe more than one,
Mhm.
began to take material from the one and add to the other, and in both directions, because it's obvious that. Like with the Garden of Gethsemane, John has eliminated the prayer of Jesus, "Let me out of this, please," and which on any sane man would say. It doesn't really reflect badly, but let's see, but in let's see, and somebody, well, let's see. Somebody has added probably the bloody sweat, is where Jesus in Luke in Gethsemane is sweating bullets, and whether it means it was actually blood infused sweat or sweat like drops of blood, I don't know, but nonetheless he's really upset. And it says an angel came, just like with Elijah, to strengthen him for the ordeal ahead. And now suddenly in John we read Jesus saying, "Well, now the hour has come, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, that's why I came to this hour." And then the heavenly voice, "Father, glorify thy name by his death." And he says, "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again." And the narrator says some people present hearing this thought it was thunder. And some thought it was an angel that had spoken to him. Well, that's what Luke thought, right? An angel gave comfort to Jesus. That can't be a coincidence. John is explicitly refuting Luke. But then there's loads of stuff that John and Luke have in common,
Mm.
often little details, but striking ones that neither shares with Matthew or Mark. And so there's some complicated relation between the two gospels. And both of them, I think, just reading them on their own, appear to be second century works.
So in
Uh,
other words, it's possible that Cerinthius wrote a proto John,
yeah,
and
could be.
then the
That's
final
right.
version came after Luke.
And look at these revelation discourses that are only in John. They sound so Gnostic. And in fact, Bultmann has loads of quotes from Gnostic sources that sound just like it. "A good shepherd am I," and so on and so on. So yeah, I think so. That was part of the Gnosticism. And again, I think our present Gospel of John, which contradicts itself, was like my favorite example. Well, like in one place, Jesus says something about his father, and they say, "You're making yourself equal to God because you said you're God's son." And he says, "Hey, look, in the Psalm, doesn't it say, 'I said you are God's'? Now, if he said this, 'I said you are God's,' to the people to whom the prophetic word of God came, you're blaming me for, I'm not even saying that. I'm just saying I'm the son of God. What's the problem?" Now, how is it you have that and you have, "Lord, show us the Father, and that'll be enough"? Philip, have I been with you this long and you still don't recognize me? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. I mean, what's going on? And then he immediately backpedals. Or don't you believe that the Father is in me and I am in the Father? Whatever that means. It just means, well, it's just what I just said. He didn't really mean that. So this, I think what happened was, how First John tells us that there was a schism. Apparently, docetic Gnostics, like the folk that wrote the Acts of John, in fact, the same stream, they started representing Docetism as the elders' doctrine. And when he hears about it, he says, oh, no, that's not me. And he repudiates them. So there are two Johannine factions, one docetic and presumably Gnostic, and the other not. Well, I think each one of them, each group had their own copy of the Gospel of John and began to edit it. And down the line, when the breach was healed or one of the groups died out, some subsequent scribe got a hold of copies from both sources and said, geez, these are not quite the same. Well, I will correlate them and interpolate the readings from this one into that one. That seems to me to be surely what happened with John, why it's so contradictory and inconsistent.
Is it, do you think it's possible that the way it happened is Cerinthus read Philo, and he might have, in his proto-John, it probably included pieces from chapter 1 about
That
the word
would certainly
manifesting.
make sense.
And then after Luke, the final guy writing the Gospel of John, we know, put all the pieces together.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense. If it wasn't Cerinthus, it was somebody like Cerinthus, and there were plenty of candidates. But the fact that he could even be nominated, by the way, some people rejected the book of Revelation because they thought it was by Cerinthus, mainly because he was a millennialist, a Chiliast, and so was Cerinthus, and this book certainly seems to say it. So, oh boy. It's a confusing but fascinating wealth of possibilities.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Price. This has been great.
Oh yeah, I love it. Thanks for having me.
And I'm pleased to announce everyone out to the viewers that he will be appearing on this channel weekly now. That is a plan we worked out recently, and he'll be returning next week for more shows. And I can't wait to
great fun.
I can't wait for it.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.